What if the missiles were never the real story? What if the real danger is flying quietly through the dark while every camera on Earth is pointed at the sky? Before we go further, if this is the kind of reporting you want more of, tap that subscribe button right now, not later, because tonight's story moves fast and you don't want to miss part 2. And if you're already subscribed, do something different this time. Send this video to one person who still thinks this war is far away from them. It isn't. Now, let's talk about what actually happened. On the 18th of August, the Gulf changed in a matter of minutes. Air raid alerts went off across the United Arab Emirates. Phones buzzed with emergency warnings telling people to get to safety immediately. Within the same narrow window, Saudi Arabia's air defenses were also responding to threats, this time from Yemen, where the Houthi movement launched an attack toward a major oil facility. Two nations, two different attackers, one almost identical moment in time. That is not a coincidence anyone should brush past. The UAE's Ministry of Defense confirmed that its systems had detected 2 ballistic missiles launched from Iranian territory. One missile fell outside the country's waters. The other came down inside them. No missile struck land, no city was hit. But that is almost beside the point, because the message was never really about damage. It was about reach. It was about proving that Iran could put a missile inside the borders of a wealthy, heavily defended American-aligned nation whenever it decides to. Iran denied it. The spokesperson for Iran's foreign ministry rejected the claim outright, calling it baseless and accusing the UAE and its allies of manufacturing false narratives. That denial matters, because it tells you something about where this war currently sits. Nobody wants to be seen taking the next big step, even while they are actively taking it. Words are being used as camouflage for actions, and that gap between what governments say and what their weapons are doing is exactly where the fear in this story lives. At almost the same hour, a separate and just as troubling incident was unfolding on the water. A vessel near the Strait of Hormuz was hit. The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Organization, the group that tracks threats to shipping in this region, confirmed a strike off the coast of Oman, right at the mouth of one of the most important waterways on the planet. This was not the only ship targeted around that time either. Reports pointed to a pattern, not a single incident, meaning commercial vessels are now being hit multiple times within the same short window. Think about what the Strait of Hormuz actually is for a moment. It's a narrow gap of water separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula. It is barely wide enough for large tankers to pass safely through in both directions. And yet, an enormous share of the entire world's oil and gas exports flow directly through that gap every single day. When you fill your car with fuel, when your power bill goes up or down, when the cost of shipping goes up, this tiny stretch of water is often the reason why. It is one of the most fragile choke points in the global economy, and right now, it is a live battlefield. President Trump addressed the situation directly, stating plainly that there are no talks currently happening with Iran, and none scheduled. He also said the naval blockade remains fully in place, that the strait itself is open for operation, and that mines previously placed in the water have been cleared or safely destroyed. On the surface, that sounds like control. It sounds like the situation is being managed. But then you look at what actually happened on the water. That same day, a tanker struck. A pattern of attacks against shipping, and the story on paper starts to look very different from the story on the ground. Trump went further still, referring to the strait as something the United States now claims direct authority over, effectively labeling it as under American control. That is an extraordinary statement. It is one thing to defend international shipping lanes. It is another thing entirely to declare ownership over a waterway that runs along another nation's coastline. If that framing holds, it changes the entire legal and political shape of this conflict, because now any future strike near that strait is not just an attack on a ship. It becomes, at least in Washington's language, an attack on something America has claimed as its own. Meanwhile, Iran's own negotiators reportedly said the strait would remain closed until certain conditions set by Tehran are met by the United States. So you have two governments, both saying the strait is under their control, both refusing to blink, both continuing military activity in and around it at the very same time. That is not a stable situation. That is two hands gripping the same wire, both refusing to let go. To really understand how we got here, it helps to zoom out for a moment. This didn't begin on August 18th. This is the latest chapter in a much longer standoff that has been building for years, one shaped by sanctions, failed negotiations, assassinations, proxy fighting, and a deep well of mistrust that runs in every direction. Iran has spent decades building what analysts often call a network of aligned forces stretching across the region, groups in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and elsewhere, each one capable of applying pressure without Tehran ever having to be the one holding the weapon directly. That structure is exactly why a missile from Iran and a missile from Yemen can land in two different countries within minutes of each other. It isn't random. It's a system designed for exactly this kind of coordinated pressure. And when you look at what's happened over the recent stretch of this war, the pattern becomes even clearer. This isn't the first time UAE air defenses have had to respond to Iranian missiles or drones. In the months before this latest attack, the country's defense systems had already engaged dozens of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones in earlier waves, some of which tragically resulted in casualties among both military personnel and civilians from multiple nations working and living there. Every new wave adds to a running total that keeps climbing. This is not an isolated flashpoint. It is one more entry in a long and painful ledger. Now, here is where the story gets stranger, and honestly, more unsettling than the missiles themselves. While the world's attention was locked on air raid sirens and missile interceptions, something quieter was happening on Iranian runways. An unmarked aircraft, believed to be a large passenger jet, landed at a Tehran airport with no visible airline markings, no publicly confirmed flight plan, and no clear point of origin. Around the same window of time, a second aircraft took off from Iran, also without a filed flight plan, also without a declared destination. And separately, another flight was tracked moving inland, away from the coast toward a mountainous region long associated with underground military facilities. Let's be honest about what we know and what we don't. We don't have a confirmed manifest. No government has stood up and said, this plane was carrying this cargo headed to this location for this reason. What we have is a pattern, 3 unusual flights, tightly clustered around the exact moment a missile war escalated across 2 countries. And patterns like that rarely happened by accident. So what could explain it? There are a few realistic possibilities, and none of them are comforting. The first is personnel. During periods of active conflict, military and political leadership often gets moved away from likely strike zones. If Iran's command structure anticipated retaliation, quietly relocating key people using unmarked aircraft would be a logical defensive move. The second is money and materials. Wars are expensive, and nations under sanctions often move currency reserves, gold, or sensitive equipment away from locations that might be targeted or frozen. And unmarked flight is a much quieter way to do that than an armored convoy rolling down a highway in daylight. The third possibility, and arguably the most serious, is military hardware. Missile components, drone parts, or equipment tied to rebuilding weapon systems that were damaged in earlier strikes by the United States and Israel. This becomes even more significant when you place it next to separate reporting that Russia has been shipping explosives, drone parts, and ammunition into Iran through Caspian Sea routes. If ground and sea logistics are already being used to resupply Iran's military, then unmarked air transport fits naturally into that same picture. A third channel, quieter, faster, and far harder to track in real time. Here's the part that should really sit with you. In a region under this much military and intelligence scrutiny, unexplained flights almost never go unnoticed. Radar systems, satellite tracking, allied intelligence sharing, all of it exists specifically to catch activity like this. And yet, as of right now, no government has stepped forward with a clear explanation. That silence is not neutral. Silence at this level of visibility usually means someone knows exactly what those planes were carrying, and has decided the public does not get to know yet. If you're starting to feel the weight of how many moving pieces this war now has, that's exactly the point. This isn't one crisis anymore, it's several, stacked on top of each other, all unfolding at the same time. Before we go into what the United States might do next, take a second and think about this. If you were a policymaker, sitting in a room tonight, watching missiles fly, ships get hit, and unmarked planes crossing borders with no explanation, what would worry you first? Type your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, the answers people give often catch things we miss in the script itself. And if you haven't already, now is a good time to hit that like button. It genuinely helps push stories like this in front of more people who need to see it, and it costs you nothing but a second of your time. Now, let's talk about what's happening behind closed doors in Washington. Reports indicate that the head of United States Central Command has expressed openness to discussions about repositioning American forces further west, away from bases in the Gulf that have already taken damage from Iranian strikes during this conflict. This is important to understand correctly. This is not talk of retreat. This is not America stepping back from the region. It is a tactical adjustment, moving personnel and assets to reduce how exposed they are to further attack. Militaries do this when they recognize that current positioning carries more risk than benefit. It's a quiet admission that the threat level around existing bases has changed. Whether that repositioning actually happens is still uncertain. Discussions inside a military command structure don't automatically become policy, but the fact that this conversation is happening at all tells you something. Even the people running the operation are recalculating risk in real time. That is not the behavior of a side that feels fully secure in its current position. At the same time, the diplomatic door appears firmly shut. Trump's statement that there are no talks scheduled with Iran at any level is about as clear a signal as you can get. Normally, even in the middle of active hostilities, there's some kind of back channel, some quiet effort to keep a door open just in case things spiral further. Right now, publicly at least, that door does not exist. And when diplomatic pressure valves get closed while military activity keeps climbing, the pressure has to go somewhere. Usually, it goes into more escalation, not less. There's another layer worth thinking about here too, and it rarely makes the headlines the way missile strikes do. Every time a major power gets pulled deeper into a regional war, other global players start recalculating their own positions. Russia's willingness to keep resupplying Iran isn't happening in a vacuum. It connects to Moscow's own long-running war in Ukraine, its relationship with Western sanctions, and its broader interest in keeping American military attention spread thin across multiple fronts at once. When one country's war becomes useful leverage for another country's separate war, the incentives to actually stop the fighting get weaker, not stronger. Nobody benefits from ending a conflict that is quietly working in their favor somewhere else on the map. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture forming here, because if you only focus on individual headlines, you miss the shape of what's actually happening. You have direct missile fire from Iran into the UAE. You have a coordinated Houthi strike against Saudi Arabia's energy infrastructure happening in the same tight window. You have repeated attacks against commercial shipping in one of the most economically important waterways on Earth. You have unexplained aircraft movement suggesting concealed transport of people, resources, or weapons. And you have a foreign power, Russia, actively resupplying the very side responsible for much of this escalation, all while the United States has ruled out negotiation and is quietly reassessing how exposed its own forces are in the region. None of these pieces exist in isolation. Together, they describe a conflict that has expanded well beyond a single missile exchange. This is now playing out on land, at sea, and in the air, involving multiple countries, multiple armed groups, and at least one major outside power feeding resources into the fight. That is the definition of a regional war widening in real time, not a contained flashpoint anymore. And here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Every time this conflict escalates, the explanation offered afterward always sounds logical in hindsight. A missile launch here, a resupply shipment there, a strategic repositioning somewhere else. Each individual event has a reasonable explanation attached to it. But strung together, over just a matter of hours, they tell a story that is much larger and much more dangerous than any single piece on its own. That is how wars widen. Not through one dramatic moment, but through a series of smaller, seemingly explainable moves that quietly add up into something nobody planned to fully commit to. And yet, nobody is willing to stop either. If you think about the ordinary people living through this, the picture becomes even harder to look away from. Families in the UAE getting emergency phone alerts telling them to seek shelter immediately. Workers near Saudi energy facilities not knowing if the next strike will hit closer to home. Sailors on commercial vessels near Hormuz now operating in waters where being struck without warning is a real possibility, not a hypothetical one. War doesn't just show up in missile counts and government statements. It shows up in the small, quiet fear of ordinary people going about ordinary days, wondering if tonight is the night things get worse. We also need to talk honestly about the global economic side of this, because it affects far more people than just those living in the region. The Strait of Hormuz carries a massive share of the world's oil and gas trade. When shipping through that corridor becomes unpredictable, insurance costs for vessels go up. Shipping companies start rerouting or delaying cargo. Energy markets react almost instantly to any sign of instability there, and that reaction ripples outward into fuel prices, transportation costs, and eventually the price of everyday goods. In countries that have absolutely nothing to do with this conflict directly, this is why a narrow strip of water on the other side of the world can end up affecting your grocery bill or your fuel prices. Global trade doesn't respect borders once panic sets in. There's also the question of credibility. This one matters more than people often realize. The United States has stated clearly that the strait remains open, that the blockade is functioning, and that mines have been cleared. But actions on the water? Repeated strikes on commercial vessels tell a more complicated story. Every time an official reassurance doesn't fully match what's actually happening in real time, trust erodes a little further. Not just public trust, but the confidence of shipping companies, insurers, and allied governments who need to believe that safety claims in this region are accurate before they commit resources, routes, or personnel based on them. This gap between stated control and observed reality is, in many ways, the most dangerous undercurrent in this entire story. Because if the credibility of these assurances keeps slipping, the pressure to respond with something bigger, something more decisive, grows heavier with each passing day. Nobody wants to be the side that looks like it lost control of the narrative, and in conflicts like this, that pressure alone can push decisions that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Now, if you've made it this far, I want to ask you something directly. Do you think this stays contained to missile exchanges and shipping strikes? Or do you think we're watching the early stage of something that pulls in far more countries before it's over? I genuinely want to know what you think, because the comment section on videos like this often becomes one of the most honest places to gauge how people outside the news cycle are actually reading the situation. And while you're down there typing your answer, go ahead and hit subscribe if this is the kind of breakdown you want delivered the moment new developments happen. Because with a story moving this fast, waiting a day for an update can mean missing something significant. Let's return to the unresolved thread running underneath everything else in this story, the mystery aircraft. It's worth repeating just how unusual this pattern really is. Unmarked planes with no filed flight data are not a normal feature of daily aviation, even inside a country actively engaged in conflict. Commercial and military aircraft operate within systems designed specifically to track them. Transponders, filed routes, coordination between air traffic authorities. Stripping that away entirely and doing it at the exact moment missiles are launching is not an oversight. It is a decision. Someone chose to move something, or someone without leaving a visible trail. That choice tells you something important even without a confirmed answer. It tells you that whatever was on those planes was considered valuable enough, or sensitive enough, to justify the risk of moving it in a way that invites exactly this kind of speculation. Whether it turns out to be personnel being relocated for safety, resources being protected from potential strikes, or military equipment being repositioned to rebuild damaged capabilities, the underlying message is the same. Someone inside this conflict believed the risk of visibility was worse than the risk of unanswered questions. And that's really the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this entire night. A war that is being fought partly in full view of the world with missile alerts, public statements, and confirmed strikes, and partly in complete silence through unmarked planes, unclaimed shipping attacks, and resupply routes that only surface in fragments of intelligence reporting. The visible war tells you where the tension is. The invisible war tells you how far people are willing to go to protect what matters most to them without anyone watching. It's also worth remembering that wars like this rarely end with a single dramatic turning point that everyone agrees on afterward. They tend to end slowly, through exhaustion, through shifting alliances, through economic pressure that eventually forces one side or another to change course. Or they don't end at all in any clean sense. They simply mutate into something quieter, a long simmering standoff punctuated by moments like this one, where things suddenly flare up before settling back into an uneasy pause. Understanding that pattern matters because it means the real question isn't whether tonight's events lead to a single decisive battle. It's whether this becomes the new normal, a region living permanently on the edge, where missile alerts and mystery flights are simply part of the background noise of daily life. As we sit here tonight, nothing about this conflict points towards slowing down. Diplomatic talks are off the table, at least publicly. Military activity is happening across land, sea, and air simultaneously. Outside powers, us, are actively feeding resources into one side of the fight. And unexplained movements continue to raise more questions than any official statement has managed to answer. Whatever happens over the next few days, and it's likely to happen quickly given the pace we've seen just in this one 24-hour window, will probably tell us more about where this war is truly headed than any single missile strike could on its own. Here's the piece I want you to walk away with tonight, more than any single detail. About missiles, ships, or mystery aircraft, wars rarely explode in one single obvious moment that everyone can point to afterward. They accumulate. A missile here, a ship struck there, a plane that shouldn't exist landing somewhere it shouldn't be. Each event on its own can be explained away, minimized, denied, or buried under an official statement designed to sound calm. But when you stack them together in the same narrow window of time across land, sea, and air, you stop looking at isolated incidents. You start looking at the shape of something much bigger already in motion. That is exactly where we are tonight. Not on the edge of a crisis, already inside one, watching it widen in real time, piece by piece, in front of a world that is still trying to decide whether to look away or pay attention. We'll be tracking every part of this as it develops. The missiles, the shipping lanes, and yes, those unmarked planes still unaccounted for. If you want to be here when the next piece of this story breaks, make sure you're subscribed, turn on notifications if you can, and share this with someone who needs to understand just how many fronts this conflict is now being fought on at once. Because the missiles are only the part of this story you're allowed to see. The rest is still flying quietly through the dark, and sooner or later, the world is going to have to answer for it.